So welcome to this little video on meaningful movement modification, and really it's just about how can we play with meaningful and relevant movement to try and create a different response. So if we change the input of what someone's doing, whether that be in terms of thought process or proprioception or energy kinetics, kinematics, whatever, does it create a different output in the way that they actually perceive the movement or the way they feel? Now, why I think it's very important to have done this kind of video diagram, just simply because it's something that we discuss, but often it's not something that people do because they don't feel like they have very much to play with or a process to actually use. So it's trying to kind of fill that gap, cross that gap between something that's deemed to be relevant, which is relevant movement, and then also how we can actually help people get to that position where they're happy to play around with relevant movement. And that's a really important thing, because making things relevant and meaningful to people, I think carries a lot more weight than just simply looking at bones and ligaments and muscles and maybe some of the more traditional measures or kind of things that we look at, strength, etc. So it's just another pathway that we can use to be able to affect people. And again, it's trying to fill that gap and cross that kind of chasm to enabling people to feel a little bit more confident, have a little bit more structure and process to what they're trying to do. Now, we're not to confuse that with a protocol. We're not to confuse that with X, do Y, do Z, follow this path, that path. If, get to A, if A is A, do B, etc., whatever. Not about that. It's just trying to find some different ways that we can play with movement that's meaningful and relevant, and to see if we can alter someone's perception of their capabilities within that movement. And that movement hopefully is important because it has an emotional attachment, or it has some element of meaning about what not being able to do, actually how that actually impacts on someone's life. So the first point of call is identifying something meaningful. And there was a small piece of research done a year or so ago looking at what we measure within physiotherapy for back pain. And what they were looking at was kind of traditional measures such as strength and range of movement, and, strength, range of movement, and pain was another measurement that they had in there. And actually, this wasn't anything that was relevant to people. That no one in the study actually wanted any of those things to be improved. They had much more meaningful aspects that they wanted to improve. A lot of them to do with physical aspects. So that might be picking up my kids, because my back pain hurts and doesn't enable me to do that. It might be tying up my shoelace, and the fact that makes me feel very, very depressed that I can't do it. The fact that I may have fear of playing football because I might go into an inversion ankle sprain. So there's a whole point of, how do we get across the gap between what's relevant and meaningful and actually enabling them to do more of what they want to do. And just looking at things like strength, range of movement may just be kind of measures that aren't actually that important. So let's look at kind of more meaningful measures. So we have two components. We have a cognitive component and we also have a physical component. Now, cognitive and physical, they're not kind of separate, and I really like the work of people like Joe Niz and also Max Zussman looking at using them concurrently. So often we have a physical, we look at physical exercise, or we look at kind of psychosocial kind of aspect, and we'll address people cognitively or more physically. And actually, I think it's important that we are able to look at both and able to kind of desensitize using movement and graded exposure, but then also kind of cognitively, but then also together, actually thinking about, the how we frame that relevant movement and discussing both cognitive component and physical component as they occur together. So there's a couple of ways that we might look at the cognitive component. First might be kind of starting to build confidence. So we might have assisted, guided, or hands-on movement. So say if someone had a fear of flexing, that we could actually provide a guided movement. We could put our hands on, we could put our hands on the trunk or the spine, provide an element of safety. We could guide the movement into different positions. We could kind of assist that by kind of, just enabling people to find different positions and different movements. So you could do that in an assisted, a guided, hands-on way, all kind of the same thing, but people may do that in some different ways. Again, mostly it would be active, but adding confidence would be the major thing too, rather than manipulating people, being there as a safety net. So I see that as a cognitive component. So we might have a meaningful movement of bending down to pick my shoelaces up. How do I maybe help someone bend down and feel safer about that? And one of the ways is that we could start to get people bending assisted by hands-on kind of approach from someone that's there with them. We could also think about discussing what people may fear from the outcome of doing that movement. And part of fear avoidance is actually in the avoidance. So that, if I avoid something, if I have a prediction that something's going to hurt me, I avoid it. Therefore, that prediction is met because I don't actually get any pain. So the avoidance actually drives the kind of the continuation of that fear avoidance process. So understanding how people may feel about doing an action and what those outcomes may be, and then we can cognitively discuss that. If we think about Lorimer Moseley's work with kind of beliefs, knowledge, logic, providing people with more logic about what's actually occurring within their body, how we may think about beliefs that they've built and that influence fears. So we have a cognitive component to what we do. So we could have a hands-on guided component, which I would describe as cognitive, and then we could also actually have a movement kind of outcome process as well. And again, this ties in very much to what people like Joe Niz and Max Zussman have discussed previously. And then actually we have this kind of physical component as well. So if we think about coming away from that movement component, well, we can then actually use the cognitive approach with the physical approach. So what we're attempting to do is kind of make the outcome better. If I have a certain fear of what's going to occur, and I can make that end result different to what you expected to happen, then that kind of forces the system to update its belief system, and that's discussed in the kind of in the psychology literature as kind of expectancy violation and the whole kind of, again, fear avoidance model. How can we actually get people to update their expectation, their prediction of what is going to occur? And I think a lot of movement therapy should actually be about that, is about updating that prediction that may stop people from going through some of those more physical components. So then we have to actually think about how can we modify those physical components. So one of the big things I find is often pre-movement behavior. So if you have back pain, you may brace and tighten your abdominal muscles before you move. You may minimize the amount of excursion that your trunk or your kind of lumbar spine goes through. We do that through bracing. You might find that with people with shoulder problems, that when they lift their arm or go into that kind of painful arc position, they very much limit range of movement by bracing of the shoulder and the abdominals, and changing in breathing and all these different things. And sometimes just altering simple stuff like pre-movement behavior creates a very profound change in the movement itself. So really, really simple stuff that if I don't tense up and stiffen up before I move in the expectation and prediction of pain, or maybe pain has become related to motor behavior or proprioception, etc., that actually by altering that stiffness, we actually get more range of movement, or we get less pain, and that instantly alters that movement. So it's very important we do that. And then you kind of see the line dip over to the very, very end from pre-movement behaviors over into discuss modified outcome. And this is that kind of updating of the system. How can we start to kind of challenge people's beliefs about what they thought was going to happen? And we can do that in a very experiential way. So I can kind of challenge bracing, change behavior, and then suddenly what we might say, well, that was different. How did that feel? It looked different. It looked smoother. It looked better. How did it feel to you? Did you expect that outcome to happen? So it's actually being able to use that kind of cognitive approach about what was the change in the experience. And once we violate that kind of expectancy, then we start to update the system. And that's really, I think, what meaningful movement is about, is trying to update that belief system by having an effect on the belief and highlighting the fact that that belief maybe wasn't as founded as it would before. So if we think about pre-movement behaviors, that's one thing. Then we can look at simply observing a movement. So if we want to alter a movement subtly, grossly, We have to actually observe the way in which people do it. And one of the big things that I'm interested in is things like movement variability, and just simply having that slight subtle ability to vary our movement is kind of probably quite a big deal to someone who has very limited repertoire of movement. And if you move differently, you may get a different output and a different response and a different kind of experience, again, to update that belief structure. So we maybe look at all observing movement, and then how can we alter movement to find a pain-free version. This is probably where it looks like it's a really, really complicated schematic diagram, line diagram, and to some degree it is way too complicated. But what I'm trying to do is just give some different options about what we could alter to create a modification of outcome, perceived outcome, actual outcome in terms of pain, whatever. So we're thinking about altering a movement. We're going to start at the very bottom, altering speed. Now, again, altering speed may simply provide less threat. Things like muscle spindles, primary afferent of a muscle spindle is about rate of change, which tells us how fast that joint is moving, how much threat that joint may be under from kind of motion, kinetics, whatever. And simply doing something slower or maybe even quicker, I don't know, may actually change the outcome. So getting someone to bend forward very, very slowly and then slowly increasing that speed and challenging the kind of motor system and the sensory system to alter slightly or relax or change stiffness may be something that creates a change in the outcome. So we could have just a really, really simple alteration in the speed at which someone does something relevantly. They may have a self-selected speed that, is normal for them. Just moving slower might create a different outcome. And then that might cause the system to kind of down-regulate or desensitize to some degree. And then what we could start to do is then challenge that and build up that kind of speed. We know that how people feel and how the motor system works, for example, in terms of stiffness, can alter very, very quickly. You go for a massage, it can change range of movement very, very quickly. You fall over and roll your ankle, you can develop a limp, which is an increase in stiffness very, very quickly. So these things are very adaptable. It's about being able to maintain these changes, which I suspect is the real challenge. But just in terms of modifying outcome, we could simply alter speed. So we could look at the same movement but alter it. So if we look above altered speed, we could look at the same movement, but that being altered. So if we think about the arrows here, we've got two going to range of movement, joint position, angle, or we could have different driver. Great example could be bending over. So someone has a fear or problem with bending over, and you see that that's particularly dominated by moving from the hip or moving from the lumbar spine or even moving from the knee. It doesn't really matter what the movement is. If we alter it, do we get a different response? So what could we do? We could simply change the driver of movement. So if I'm very knee dominant, I could move more from the hip. If I'm very hip dominant, I could move more from the knee. You might find someone is very lumbar spine dominant when they bend over, and I could encourage more bending of the knee and the hip. And that again may be still the action of bending over, but the way it's kinematically organized may be different. That might send different kinetics, it might send different kinematics, it might send different proprioception, it might send different nociception. So just altering that movement by just the way in which it is orientated or organized within the body, which is a collection of a multiple amount of joints, just simply altering that may change that response profoundly. We could do the same thing with range of movement. So if I'm bending over, I could ask someone to bend over not quite as far. I could ask someone to bend over further through the pain that they're experiencing. You never know. These things may all alter the final response. We could change joint position or angle. If I bend slightly to the left or to the right, or rotate slightly as I bend, do I get a different response? Is it the concept of bending, or is it a very specific position within bending? And if I alter that very, very specific position, do I get an alternative outcome? Okay, so these are all little things that we could just kind of play with just to alter these factors. So we could look at the same joint movement, but a different context. So again, bending over is a great example. So I could actually ask someone to go onto all fours and do just a basic pelvic tilt. I could ask them to go 2-point kneeling, or, like a kneeling with the right knee on the ground and the left foot on the ground, so like a stride stance. And again, I could ask them to flex and extend the pelvis, which is going to have an effect, or tilt the pelvis, which is going to have an effect on the flexion and extension of the lumbar spine. So I could do the same joint movement in a different context. And then we could see, does that have a desensitizing effect on the sensory system or the motor system when we actually integrate it back into the more relevant version of bending over, which may be picking up my kids. It may be bending down and doing up my shoelace. Another thing that we can do is look at a different part of the range. So if I think about the action of flexing, I could flex from an extended position. So rather than flexing into a flexed position, I could flex within the actual joint position of extension. So the motion would be a flexion motion, moving from very extended to less extended. But the joint position may never become as threatening as the system perceives. Again, does that desensitize me physically in terms of muscle spindles or nociceptors or any of these other factors when I actually start to integrate that back into a relevant movement? Now, I could integrate that back into a relevant movement almost instantaneously if I think that's going to create a great change. Or I could actually do that further on down the line when I think there may have been a little bit more time for an adaptation to the kind of new perceived demand of the action. And most importantly, what we see is, again, this discussion of modified outcome. If I'm successful in altering things, discussing that modified outcome and that change in belief, and the fact that whatever belief was there in terms of pain, whatever belief was there in terms of fear, potentially didn't come true, and that we can then start to use a cognitive and physical experiential approach to actually create some kind of change. And what I'm trying to do is present a number of different ways that we can potentially play with movement within the concept of a relevant movement to someone. So can we move the same joint in a different movement in a context? Can we do the same movement but slightly altered in the way that's made up of different joints moving, or the position that those joints go into? Could I alter speed? And the whole point is then, what modification does that make? What change does that make? And then how do we get that across to someone in terms of their belief structure and their belief system, that can then look to alter their future prediction of how this movement may make them feel. Okay, so again, just playing with variables. It's not a process, it's not a protocol. Well, I suppose it is a loose process of things that we can play with. Again, probably a little bit more of a methodology than a method, just trying to give people just some ideas and some options that they can go away and start to kind of fill that gap between thinking about relevant movement and actually how to use relevant movement.